you here from all over the world. Good morning. If you would not mind, as a little bit of housekeeping, and I'm happy to walk you through this if you're not familiar, if you would not mind renaming yourself with your first name and the location you're calling in from. My name is Malika Rollins. I'm the convenings manager at Humentum. In terms of renaming yourself, in case you don't know, if you go into your little video screen and hover in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see 3 dots. If you click on those 3 dots and scroll down to the 5th option, it says rename. And you can rename yourself that way. So if you could rename with your first name and the location you're calling in from. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the OpEx365 Launch. We are thrilled to have you all here from all over the world. And my name is Malika Rollins. I'm the convenings manager here at Humentum. And if you would not mind renaming yourselves with your first name and where you're calling in from. And I'm going to put a little fun quiz in the chat, and I'll also say it as well. So this is a little contest. Can you, in the chat, can you guess the number of countries we have represented in our registrants? So how many, how many countries do you think we have registered? How many countries? And I will tell you the answer shortly. How many countries do we have represented? Oh, they're flying in before I can even type. Wow, I love the guesses. How many countries do you think we have represented? How many countries? Welcome everyone to OpEx365. We're so excited to launch our year of transformation and virtual learning. My name is Malika Rollins and I am the convenings manager at Humentum. And in the chat, if you'd like to contribute to our little morning contest, how many countries do you think we have represented in our registration? And I'm going to say the answer now. So we have 67 countries represented. And the farthest away, I think, are probably 2, Australia and Papua New Guinea. We have 2 folks registered from Papua New Guinea, which I think is quite exciting and quite a distance, at least from Washington, D.C., depending on where you are. Welcome, everyone. My name is Malika Rollins. I'm the convenings manager at Humentum, and we're so excited you're joining us for our launch of OpEx365, our year of virtual learning and transformation. One more question. Can you raise your hand, either your virtual hand or your real hand, if you are a Humentum member? Are you a Humentum member or from a member organization? Please raise your hand. You can raise your virtual hand as well. Thank you. So again, we're so happy you are joining us, and it's 10:03, at least in Washington, D.C. time. I'm now gonna introduce and turn the microphone over to Christine So, who is our CEO, and she will tell you about Humentum and why we are all here today. And again, welcome. We are thrilled and grateful that so many of you are here. 186 so far. Christine.
Thanks so much, Malika. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We are really excited about today's event, and we're excited about what we are going to be launching today. Many of you will know that Humentum has held an in-person conference for many years, and this year, of course, that was not possible due to the coronavirus pandemic. We have really tried to take advantage of all of the opportunities and challenges that has posed to us and to our community. And we have tried to design something that we are launching today that will keep going over the course of the coming year, that will give you a chance to come together, to meet your peers, to work with your peers on co-creating solutions to the biggest challenges that we are facing. So today we are coming together to celebrate work that our peer organizations and member organizations have accomplished over the past year, and we will really hear from them about how they have responded in a constructive, impactful way to dealing with the challenges the pandemic has thrown at all of us. And we will then hear from our invited guest, Heba Ali, coming from the New Humanitarian, who will really challenge us, I think, I know, I hope, to think about how we are doing things as we go forward. So what is Humentum's role in this? You know, Humentum, we are a membership organization, but we are much more than that. We really want to work with the global development community at large to help us be as impactful, as efficient, as working with the most impact and effect as possible within our own communities, within the communities that have invited us in to work with them. And we want to help you as Humentum members and you as Humentum non-members, think about membership, to join us in looking at what those challenges are and how are we going to approach those challenges with practical approaches, operational approaches. At the same time, we are really encouraging everyone to think about what are the opportunities that we have to respond to the calls for equity, for accountability, for a just society, and how can we use good and strong, robust policies, standards, and operational approaches to help us actually work in a more equitable and resilient and just way. So today, it's an opportunity for us to come together. We will be working on all of these issues over the coming year. My colleague Kim will be telling you more about the OpEx365 event series, and we encourage you to register for that if you have not already registered for it. But in any case, we will also be holding many of our usual support events for Humentum members as well, and we continue to support the global development community at large. So really excited to be here today. I see we have more people joining us every few minutes. We've got 237 people online right now, and really welcome, and we look forward to your participation in today's events, your contributions. We have the chat function going. I want to invite everybody as we go along. If you have questions or comments, please share them in the chat. While Heba is giving her talk, please feel free to share questions or comments in the chat, and we will be integrating those into the discussion with Heba. So we really want to make this as interactive and participatory an event as possible. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Kim, who is our Director of Member Services and really has just done a great job in leading us through the process of designing and launching OpEx365 and the event that we're at today. So Kim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Welcome, everybody. As Christine mentioned, this is our launch of OpEx365, which is our reimagined conference. And if you had asked me last year when we were at the convention center in Washington, D.C., if this is where we would be, I never would have imagined that this is where we would be. But here we are, and I am actually feeling the same kind of energy and the same excitement as we launch this event, even though it will be an extended event over the year instead of over just 3 days. And I think, as Christine mentioned, this really is a time, it's an unprecedented time. It's a time of change. It's a time when things feel like there are topics and themes and moments that are all converging all at once on us. And when we thought about what we would want to do with regards to a conference, what we realized was that we couldn't just take our traditional conference format, because these are not traditional times. And so these are in many ways transformational times. We hope that they are. We think that they are. And what we wanted to do instead is to create a space where we could go on this journey of really uncertainty together. And so one of the things that is really core and essential to Humentum is the belief that we're stronger together, the belief in community, and the belief in collective action. And so OpEx365 really is designed for us to go on this journey together. It's designed to bring together the perspectives of many. We have weekly solution sessions starting tomorrow, which are programmed from a very active and changing ideas bank that we are gathering ideas from you all on a regular basis. We do a lot of listening throughout the year with our trainers and our partners and our members. And from those ideas, we're able to program really responsive, relevant, practical programming over the next year. So that's our plan on topics like HR and managing donor funds and compliance and risk, and all of those really fun and essential topics. And then we will do what we do best, which is bring people together to really engage with those ideas and with those solutions. And we're expecting people from all over, which for me is really exciting this year. Different geographies, different levels, different functional areas, all coming together, figuring out how are we moving forward in this really unprecedented time. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about what you can expect with OpEx365. Really, it's all of the different elements of a conference, but just extended from today all the way through June of next year, with weekly solution sessions focusing on real-time challenges and solutions. Things like creating strong cultures of respect, recognizing changes to our workforces, what risks are we facing, how do we manage funding, and then as you can see, punctuating the year are 3 separate retreats where we can really stop and pause and tackle the big questions. So in November, we'll be tackling questions like, how do we actually put localization into practice? We talk about it a lot, but in practice, what does that mean? And then what does a virtual NGO look like? Many of us have kind of cobbled it together, but what does a thriving virtual NGO look like? In really practical ways, some of these big topics in really practical ways. And then we're also very excited to have a parallel CEO track running throughout the year as well. And so this will happen in 3 different trimesters throughout the year. So you can see we have solution sessions and retreats, solution sessions and retreats, solution sessions and retreats. And going throughout the whole year in the center, we focus on community building and networking and having resources available for the community to help us to navigate through this. So we're very excited to be kicking off the event this year. Right now, we have our first solution session scheduled for tomorrow. It's called Building a Culture of Respect, Equity, and Inclusion, which is something that we've been hearing over and over and over from our members, and something that we really want to dive into. And so far, I've really been excited to see the response, especially to see organizations start to send groups to this event over the course of the year, which is going to allow teams to really learn together so that we can enact change over the course of the year. So you are all very welcome. I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat or offline. And I'm excited to start our programming. Over to you, Malika. Malika, you're on mute.
Hope and inspiration, qualities we can all agree are welcome in our world today, but may be in short supply. You will soon hear the stories of 7 extraordinary people and teams making a positive impact in the global development sector and reigniting us with a sense of optimism. Honoring these contributors with our annual Operational Excellence Awards is a Humentum tradition. To recognize these 7 visionaries, I introduce my colleagues, Jessica Walker and Lourdes Isilge.
Thank you, Malika. It goes without saying that COVID-19 has affected us all. In Honduras, but all essential businesses closed, public, private, and NGO actors all scrambled to provide relief measures to troubled sectors and to coordinate responses effectively to facilitate recovery. This is where our first awardee, ACDI Boca's Honduras TMS team, stepped in. Their extraordinary efforts brought together diverse and at odds public and private sector actors, ensuring a coordinated response to the crisis. For example, the team facilitated national level working groups to help public and private sector engage in dialogue and coordinate action to cope during these testing times.
Their success highlights the impact of working through local systems instead of around or despite them. The team's initiatives could have been managed by the project alone, but not with the same scale or impact. Mobilizing public and private actors requires credibility, skill, hard work, and diligence. This approach is key to achieving lasting systemic change in local systems. Congratulations to everyone involved. You are a shining example of the power of coordination and collective action.
It's an honor to share more about our second awardee. The October 2019 uprising in Lebanon, combined with the more recent pandemic, has had a detrimental impact on the country's economy and social fabric. ANERA had to adapt to meet the rapidly changing needs among an increasingly vulnerable population. Samar El-Jassir, ANERA's country director, met this crisis head-on to help local communities and those most affected. Amid political and economic unrest, and with hundreds of businesses shutting down, Samar brought together the program and regional leaders to discuss the implications of this crisis and the need to adapt. As a result, ANERA's vocational training shifted from job skills for industries no longer hiring to skills that could provide revenue in light of the growing humanitarian crisis. Today, the Syrian, Palestinian, and Lebanese youth in ANERA's program are learning essential skills while earning an income and supporting their communities.
Overall, the speed and effectiveness of ANERA's response, led by Samar, has resulted in increased support for the organization's programs. Through Samar's inspiring leadership, ANERA's Lebanon staff know that they can and are making a difference to improve the lives of the people they work to support. Samar's work demonstrates that adaptation is not just a buzzword, it is a necessity that can change lives. Congratulations, Samar. We are truly inspired by your capacity to adapt and lead during these turbulent times.
I am pleased to introduce our next awardee, Dr. Petra Kruger, Senior Technical Advisor with the RM Institute. Several obstacles stand in the way of sustainable impact when implementing initiatives to strengthen health systems. This includes interventions that do not address the capacity and skills of middle and facility level managers. These are the people who will carry the work forward once the development organization has moved on. Dr. Kruger designed and delivered a unique management development program which equips primary healthcare facility managers with practical skills in managing and running a clinic or health center. Trained, confident, and capable managers of primary healthcare facilities are critical to longer-term outcomes of all ongoing clinical and public health activities.
Through Dr. Kruger and her team's dedicated efforts, Orem Institute facility managers are now empowered with the skills and knowledge required to fulfill their work. This means other efforts for public health good are much more likely to be sustainable. Congratulations on this well-deserved recognition, Dr. Kruger. We are very impressed by your extraordinary work. It serves as a reminder that we must invest in the communities that will remain once our organization's work has moved on.
Early last year, Samaritan Spurs recognized the need for a talent pipeline that would provide the organization with high-quality, mission-driven staff to fill critical positions. Teresa Decker, Manager of Learning and Performance Support, led the creation of an apprenticeship program and immediately designed a change management plan revolving around the curriculum and program development process. The program has accelerated the process for employee onboarding and job training. As with most employee onboarding, Samaritan Spurs does not typically see a return on investment until the 6th to 9th month mark. This is too slow for the rapidly evolving world of humanitarian relief, where staffing needs can change from one month to the next. Through this program, the organization now sees a return in its core competency as an organization, disaster response. If apprentices have mastered disaster response, they are well equipped to adapt and grow in other ways the organization demands.
The impact of this program goes beyond just teaching technical skills in a classroom. Employees must also grasp the mission and ethos that drives their identity as Good Samaritans. This identity doesn't show up on a post-test or performance review, but it does show up when tested by fire. The pandemic tested each apprentice, and with the skills they learned, they thrived. Teresa Decker, your extraordinary efforts are an example of how strong foundations allowed Samaritan's Purse to be prepared and agile during these testing times. Congratulations on your impressive achievement.
Every year, the process to select our OpEx awardees is a difficult one, and occasionally we decide that we need to recognize the work of just one more organization. We are pleased to highlight Catholic Relief Services Project Insight team as our 2020 Honorable Mention awardee. Project Insight is a massive business transformation effort designed to improve CRS operational excellence. The Project Insight team challenged everyone to think more creatively about HR, finance, and supply chain processes, working tirelessly over 3 years on a cloud-based integrated system. When the team went live during the global pandemic, they had developed a detailed process to ensure smooth go live with no surprises and few significant issues. They also pivoted to create remote training sessions and a unique set of office hour sessions to support their colleagues.
The impact is clear to see. As an example, CRS ran a COVID-19 employee engagement survey within days instead of a month or more. CRS now enjoys an accurate and accessible global HR system. Through innovation, creativity, agility, and continuous improvement, the organization has come together as one agency through technology, systems, and processes. Congratulations to the CRS Project Insight team for a job well done.
In addition to our members, Humentum's OpEx Awards are an opportunity to honor our partners. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Learning Pool. Learning Pool is vital to the work Humentum does, helping those across the sector reach their full potential. There are many reasons why this platform is so powerful, but what we value most is the ability to efficiently deliver engaging content while also driving the peer-to-peer learning and idea exchange that is often absent from online courses. This enables us to train groups as community and not just as a block of people. The team supports our mission wholeheartedly and are always on hand to help us make the most of the platform and deliver the best possible learning experience. Without their valuable support, we would not have been able to reach thousands of learners over the last 12 months with dedicated instructor-led courses. As well as supporting Humentum, Learning Pool provides dedicated internal learning platforms for organizations including Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, and Mercy Corps. Through their assistance, these organizations are improving staff performance and organizational delivery. Learning Pool, we are grateful for your valued partnership and are pleased to recognize you as our 2020 OpEx Partner Awardee.
Our industry partners support Humentum, our members, and the sector with their expertise, resources, and tools. Often, they go above and beyond to provide solutions that transform operations. I'm excited to name Sage Intacct as our 2020 Industry Award winner. Since implementing Sage Intacct, one of our members has eliminated thousands of hours of manual work, and the finance team has saved $500,000 per year while shortening its monthly close by more than 30%. The team now closes their books 5 days faster, freeing up a week each month they can spend on verifying and analyzing the data. Another member was also able to cut a week from their close process using Sage Intacct. Both of these members are better able to report accurate, timely data back to their donors, which increases trust in their organizations and demonstrates that they are effective stewards of the millions of dollars they receive from donors. Today, nonprofits are under a new level of pressure for transparency and accountability. On limited resources, they must find a way to achieve and measure successful outcomes. Partnering with Sage Intacct has resulted in increased credibility, accountability, and donor confidence. We appreciate their support as an industry partner and are honored that they are our 2020 OpEx Industry Awardee.
We are thrilled to be able to recognize our 2020 OpEx awardees and will continue to illustrate their incredible work on our website, blog, and social media over the coming weeks and months. Their accomplishments exemplify the creative solutions we all need to consider as we address the challenges our sector and the world are facing. We are honored to be part of a sector that is working hard to adapt, grow, learn, and work toward a better world. Congratulations again to all our awardees and nominees for your hard work. Over to you, Malika.
Thank you. Very impressive work to all our winners. Good job. I will now introduce our guest speaker, Hiba Ali, and after which Christine will lead a Q&A with Hiba. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and we will incorporate them into the Q&A. A multimedia journalist by training, Hiba spent 1 decade reporting from conflict zones in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia before moving into management, where she's currently the director of the New Humanitarian. Her work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Christian Science Monitor, Bloomberg News, and the New Humanitarian, among others, took her to places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Chad, and Libya. And she received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for her work in Northern Sudan. Hiba has worked with the New Humanitarian in different capacities since 2007, including as field correspondent and Middle East editor, and played a key role in planning and integrating IRIN, the Integrated Regional Information Network's spinoff from the UN to become an independent media organization. Her recent TED Talk, titled Stop Eating Junk News, drives home the importance of responsible journalism from crisis zones. She's a regular commentator on humanitarian policy in her published work, in governmental briefings, and at conferences around the world. She's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Humanitarian System, and in 2018 was named one of 100 young global leaders under 40. She was also named one of the 100 most influential Africans of 2018 by New African magazine. Take it away, Hiba.
Thank you very much, Malika, for that kind introduction, and it's nice to be here. Great to see all of you virtually. A brief word about the New Humanitarian, because it relates to what I'm going to talk about today. As many of you will know, we are a nonprofit news organization that reports about humanitarian crises. And we set out to rebrand last year from, as Malika mentioned, what was then IRIN. And we're trying to decide on a name. And the reason we came up finally with the New Humanitarian, and just a little anecdote, it was actually the Humanitarian along the lines of The Economist, and we decided to add new in there because we wanted to, as the news organization that chronicles crises and the way the world responds to them, to examine what humanitarianism looks like in the modern era, on the assumption that the way we do humanitarian action today is not the way it was done 50, 100 years ago. So what should it look like today in an age of kind of messy, political, protracted crises? And I obviously come at my comments from a humanitarian perspective, but these are certainly the same issues across the aid spectrum as far as I'm concerned. And just a disclaimer, which is that I'm not a kind of original thinker on a lot of what I'm going to tell you. What I am is a good curator of ideas, and we come across a lot of them at the New Humanitarian. So I'm going to try to share with you some of the ideas we've come across, especially in recent months, as we have been putting together a series called Rethinking Humanitarianism. And because this is such a dense topic, I will drop in links as I go along to articles and resources that you can look at to dig a bit deeper into some of the elements of what I say. So to start with, here is our series on Rethinking Humanitarianism, which you might want to have a look at. So that series kind of started in 2020, we set out to look at the past and the present and the future of humanitarianism without any idea of how much the world was going to change in the months to follow, and just how timely a discussion that would become. This year is our 25th anniversary, so we have been reporting about crises for 25 years, and we thought, okay, good time to look back on how crises have evolved in the last quarter century, whether aid has delivered on its promise, and what lessons could be drawn for the future. And then a global pandemic shook the entire world and overwhelmed healthcare systems, even in developed countries, dramatically challenged the way aid is delivered on so many levels, hit funding models hard, and led to a whole bunch of operational complexities that you will all be very well aware of. And of course, if that wasn't enough, the resurgent Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of killing of unarmed Black men in the US has led to another moment of reckoning for the sector, in which we've seen humanitarians asking themselves, to what extent are we equipped to relieve suffering in the West? Does racism exist within the humanitarian aid sector? And perhaps more fundamentally, to what extent is the sector part of or even propping up a world order that for many is designed to keep power and resources in the hands of some people, some countries, while keeping other people and countries poor and powerless. So suddenly, our kind of 25-year anniversary project took on a life of its own and became an urgent priority. And I've been speaking about these questions of power and humility in aid for quite some time. And there was always a fair bit of interest, but often very little concrete action. And I think in the wake of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, suddenly everyone understands why change is not only necessary, but inevitable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see that inevitability, and then hopefully a few ideas for starting points in that transition or in that transformation. It's going to be quite a lot of ideas coming at you at once, so I apologize in advance, but my brain just likes to fart things out. So as I see it, both COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement have identified or re-exposed the structural problems at the heart of the aid endeavor. Operationally, financially, and ethically, the current model has really just reached its limits. So I'll take those in turn. Operationally, parachuting or surging people into a crisis works when there is one crisis or a few crises at a time. That is not possible when the crisis is everywhere, hitting everyone at the same time. The parachute just isn't big enough, as one person I interviewed once said. And we saw that with COVID, where both the aid industry, but also governments were completely overwhelmed. And we will see it 100 million times worse when climate change picks up speed, because you will have a crisis that engulfs the entire world at a scale in which the sector is just simply not equipped to deal with. And so of course there's the kind of short-term operational challenges of COVID and I suppose what it means for a sector to be so dependent upon travel and shipping and not really know how to function when those things are disrupted. But then there's that much bigger question of whether that model is appropriate when crises become the norm. Financially, early predictions are a sharp drop in overseas development assistance of $25 billion in 2021, including from some of the biggest donors. So that would be 15% of total ODA flows in 2018. A survey by Bond, a network of UK charities that you will surely be aware of, found that international NGOs in the UK risked losing 1/3 of their total income because of reductions in individual giving. And so funding is about to go way down, just as the needs are about to go way up because of the knock-on effects of the pandemic: hunger, livelihoods, access to healthcare, and so on. And so in the short term, this could wipe out NGOs altogether, some of the smaller ones. In the long term, it is bound to force some questions about the business model. And then lastly, ethically, I think the hypocrisies of the system were always there, but they are just so on display now that it's hard to avoid. And in particular, white supremacy culture within aid institutions. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has awakened a whole conversation around racism in aid, and that's absolutely a legitimate topic of conversation. And I'm going to drop in actually a really, really interesting basically long testimonial that we published about what institutional racism looks like in an aid organization. And I'm sorry to pick on MSF because it has gotten a lot of bad press lately, and that story is about one person's experience of these kind of microaggressions for year after year within MSF, but it's obviously a sector-wide problem. But it isn't really, for me, about the racism within organizations. It is much more about the way the entire structure is set up, both within the aid world, and there it's on display in the sector's resistance to giving up power to those that it's actually meant to serve, and why the localization movement has been struggling to get off the ground. But also internationally, in the whole premise that aid is a transfer of wealth, of knowledge, of kindness from developed countries to developing countries. And we've seen in both COVID-19 and BLM that notion just does not hold true. The developed world fared much worse in many cases than developing, so-called developing countries in the face of COVID. And the most developed country in the world is on the verge of a humanitarian crisis, as we're seeing with what is approaching civil war in some of the streets of the United States of America. And frankly, if what was happening in the US was happening in any other country, it would be considered a humanitarian crisis, which is an ethnic minority being killed in broad daylight by the authorities for no crime whatsoever. So we have a situation in which the kind of fundamental premise and definitions of humanitarianism are now being questioned. And I want to quote an amazing guy named Uzo Iweala, who's a Nigerian American author, and he heads up the Africa Center in New York. And he joined an event that we hosted just after George Floyd was killed. And I'm going to drop the link in as well for that, because it was really just a fascinating conversation about the neo-colonial foundations of aid. And he said, and sorry, I'm just going to ask, I think it might be you, Rachel, to mute if you can. Thank you. And he said, the liberal capitalist world order, including international aid institutions that were developed in the post-World War II era, are now charged with helping the world's poor, but that whole system was built on the backs of slaves and slave labor that amounts to at least $16 trillion. And if that was paid back at minimum wage, according to one estimate. And he said, aid only works if people believe that Black people will always be an underclass. Sorry, Rachel, I'm gonna ask you again if you don't mind muting. So aid only works if Black people are seen as an underclass. It's buying into the system to believe that the West or the North will always be on top, and that it's money from rich countries going to poor countries, when in fact he calls it reparations for the money that was stolen. So I think it's just important to recognize that certain countries remain in crisis and poor for a reason, and that is an international order that was set up to be extractive and to privilege certain countries over others. And so that has prompted, as you all know, a massive conversation now about how to decolonize aid. And I think that starts with, and I'm sorry that all this is so macro, and I will try to bring it back down to earth in a second, but that starts with a recognition of the terms that are used and the definitions that we have become accustomed to, and what that says about the biases that we have. And so perhaps instead of calling this whole industry aid, which suggests that there's a strong party that is helping a weak party, perhaps it's time to think about it as solidarity and as everyone helping each other. I think the second ethical question for me, and maybe it's more of an effectiveness question, but it equally kind of puts the whole definition of aid into question, is, or at least of humanitarianism. If you look at the recent crises, these are challenging where humanitarians put their energies and the role that they see for themselves in society. So, right now, what are the threats facing the world? Of course, there is hunger and there is war and so on, but a lot of it comes down to inequality, abuse, predatory economics, and in that landscape, an apolitical framing of aid is coming into question. So COVID was in principle a humanitarian crisis, but it really didn't have a humanitarian solution. Black Lives Matter, as I said, was arguably a humanitarian crisis in the US. And yet humanitarianism wasn't really the answer to that crisis either. And today's needs, many of them are, justice, social welfare, equality, not bags of rice and tarpaulin. And so if the goal of the whole aid endeavor is to relieve human suffering, there may be more effective ways of doing so in 2020 than the old model that everyone has become accustomed to. And to quote Danny Sriskanaraja, who is the chief executive of Oxfam GB, I heard him at a conference a couple of years ago when he was at Civicus, and he said, before the annual reports and the pay scales and the business plans and the bureaucratic processes, aid workers were passionate, inspired volunteer activists who were connecting and empowering and talking about things like solidarity. That's where the pulsing heart was. So could these crises push international aid into a kind of new life that gets away from a technocratic approach and into an approach which, of course, many development NGOs do have as part and parcel of their work, which is solidarity and activism. So I want to pause for a minute. So if we say, operationally, financially, ethically, the current system has kind of reached its limits and reform is necessary, you might say, well, we've been here before. We've talked about reform ad nauseum for decades. Is this any different? Will this be in the long term kind of a blip in history? And I think the difference is that past reforms haven't been asking the right question. They haven't been solving for the right problem. And a colleague of mine wrote, and I'll just keep dropping things in here, but it wrote a long narrative piece looking at kind of the whole history of the last 25 years of humanitarianism and all the different attempts at reform along the way, and why they hadn't actually led to any meaningful change. And it was that they were often technocratic changes. And I think what's different here is that this conversation is becoming one about power and justice in a way that it hasn't been, at least in the humanitarian sector in the past. That said, I don't think change is guaranteed. And just at the start of the pandemic, I remember in the humanitarian sector, everyone was talking about how this was going to be like a transformative moment, and there would be a before and after COVID-19 in humanitarian action, and this was going to be the turning point for localization. It's going to be the turning point for the business model. And in reality, a lot of those transformations have not borne out. That's not to say that this moment won't be transformative, but that it can't be taken for granted, and it will take a concerted effort to make change happen. And when I actually started kind of delving into some of these questions, you saw, okay, well, actually all of the money for the COVID response has gone to the big UN agencies, kind of maintaining the status quo in terms of power dynamics. Or actually, when it comes to localization, it hasn't actually been that different for many of the local humanitarian aid workers I've spoken to. The status quo is more or less carried on as it was before. And so I think, as I say, this is not going to happen on its own. So what is the roadmap for the way forward? We've come across a whole range of ideas around different ways of doing things. And so I just share a few of them with you. One is to become, for international NGOs, to become the intermediary in the best sense of the term. So rather than doing field level delivery, is there a role for international NGOs in advocacy, in fundraising, in being the liaison between the international community and the field? Can international NGOs be reimagined as a platform for enabling and supporting locally led response? Or to take that a step further, could international NGOs be available to be subcontracted by local NGOs to provide specific expertise. So you as an international NGO have certain technical capacity, maybe it's reporting and due diligence, maybe it's specific expertise in water and sanitation. And when a local NGO needs that specific expertise, they call on you and they give you a contract to provide them a service, basically flipping the switch from the current modus operandi. A second, well, I suppose third model to think about is what Paul Curian calls a network humanitarianism. And I'll drop in a research paper he wrote for that, about that for ODI. But in the broader societal shift of the network society, the world isn't top down anymore, right? People trust their peers, they don't trust the elite. How could aid kind of go along with the changes that are happening in society more broadly in leveraging the network society? So could an Airbnb model of aid be possible, whereby somebody needs something at a local level, they express their need on a digital platform, and then they have the choice of several service providers, and they get matched up with the service provider that gives them the best deal, and they make the choice of which service provider that is. You can see that each of these is just kind of a more dramatic version of the one before. But here again, like we've seen with many other sectors, is there a way of cutting out the intermediary and empowering the user or the customer to take things into their own hands, make their own choices, and get a more bespoke, tailored response to their needs? And this is already happening. If you look at the networked response to the migration crisis in Europe, that was a bunch of volunteers who were basically using this kind of a model. When I was in Syria at the start of the war, it was very similar. There were networks of local volunteers who were organizing themselves to fill specific needs. And then one last model I'd like to highlight is consolidation and mergers. I think it was one of the UK aid officials who said in a speech once that there were 7,000 NGOs in the response to the Nepal earthquake in 2015. I would be hard pressed to explain why or how 7,000 NGOs could provide very distinct and added value over one another. And Simon O'Connell, the former head of Mercy Corps UK, was quite a prominent advocate of consolidation and merger in the aid sector. And he argued that if you looked at any given crisis, so let's say Mosul in Iraq, each NGO is spending, let's say $500,000 US just in their overheads to have country directors and security focal points and procurement people. And if you merged all those overhead costs, you could save, to his count, $1 million per context per year. And imagine how that could be reinvested. I think he put out an open call for anyone who would want to merge with Mercy Corps. I don't think anyone took him up on it. But you know, these are real practical ideas. I think they sound quite radical, but if I am to quote from somebody else, and I don't even know who it is because I just jotted it down in my notebook one day, but they said radical ideas start as luxuries, then they become threats, then they become up for debate, and then they become normalized. And so the biggest area that you can change is your own mindset, and leaders need to be radical in their leadership because it doesn't start anywhere else. So where do you start? What does that look like? And Danny of Oxfam UK was saying, very interestingly, I think, you don't have to wait for a systemic overhaul to start doing better. There is such a thing as an incremental approach. And in the event I mentioned earlier that we did about neocolonialism and aid, you know, a lot of the speakers were talking about taking a sledgehammer to all of the big institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and they had to start all over again. And there certainly is, I think, a spirit of revolution among many. But there are also small, simple things you can do that will be better than yesterday. So I'll share a few of the ideas from Stephanie Kimu, who's a Black international development specialist, specifically on the decolonization of aid. Number one, accept that racism exists. So saying that you're not a racist isn't not enough. What are the steps that you are taking to dismantle white supremacy culture? Have an exit strategy. You shouldn't be working in Haiti, she says, for 50 years without having any plan of how you're going to exit. Number 3, elevate local expertise. You know, buy the books of the local people, invite them to speak, honor and elevate their rooted expertise in a meaningful way. And we have done a whole series of articles about locally led humanitarian response and the frustrations of local aid workers. And I remember one thing that really stuck with me, such a simple thing. They said, give credit to local partners when you read a press release. Like, why are you erasing them from the story when in fact they're the ones doing all the work? And finally, she said, understand colonial histories and trauma. Don't go into a country without having read the history and understanding at least how you will be perceived and what the experience of the people that you are going to serve may mean for how they perceive you. So just a few examples on decolonizing aid to say there are some starting points. More broadly, look at your people. What is the pipeline for leadership in your organization? Look at your board. Who is on your board? Can you start introducing talent that will bring diversity and different perspectives to your team? More broadly than decolonization, I'd say on some of the kind of changes that I've described needing to take place, how do you start? Abandon competition and this kind of this obsession with staking your ground and saving your space. In the Netherlands, there's this outfit called the Dutch Relief Alliance. And basically all of the NGOs in the country were essentially forced by the government to unite under this kind of network in which to access government funding, they must together as a group decide in any given crisis who is best placed among them to respond. Rather than all of the agencies going in, they have to pick 2 or 3 that have the greatest added value in that particular crisis. And they do that collectively as a group. And that's just a different way of thinking in again, saying, if our goal is to alleviate suffering, what's the best way of doing it and how can we work together to achieve that goal, rather than I want to get the most money, I want to be the one known for having saved the day in this response. I think one other thing I would point to, and sorry, again, I told you it would be a brain fart, but if we look at kind of where do you start in trying to make these transformations? There was a really interesting report written by Paul Knox-Clark for LNAP a few years back around how change happens. And he said it's kind of like a football field or a soccer, I'm Canadian, a soccer field, where, you know, wherever the ball is, the whole team kind of runs after it. And he said, identify where there are organic changes taking place at a very small scale and then support them and scale them up. So you don't have to start from scratch, but where are things already happening? And then how can you boost and elevate those changes? So as an example, I talked about network humanitarianism, which might seem like a crazy kind of sci-fi idea. But then you look at the H2H network, which is a humanitarian to humanitarian kind of B2B network of organizations that serve other humanitarian organizations rather than people in need. And that's exactly what they are. They are a network. When they go into a crisis, they say, okay, what are the needs here? And it's through network kind of calling in and out of services that they operate. So these examples do exist, and it's just a matter of identifying them and then slowly allowing them the space to grow. And then I would just say that I think, you know, these are one decision at a time kind of changes, right? Like with every decision you make, you have the potential to make a bit of change. So Oxfam Colombia closed its office after the pandemic. Not 100%, but more or less they've moved to remote operations because they realized that they didn't need to have this big physical office and they could actually be much closer to the people by just being remote. Oxfam International has pulled out of 18 countries in the last few months in a bid to, again, partly forced by the financial situation, but partly as a move towards the localization agenda. So, you know, you can look at one country at a time, you can look at one decision at a time, how, if that's the kind of end goal, do you get closer to it? Just a last word about donors, because Christine had asked me, you know, how do you bring the donors along? And I think COVID is a real opening for that because they have already changed their behavior in so many ways. The restrictions that used to be, I mean, you guys will know better than I, that used to be seen to be absolutely necessary have suddenly gone out the window, and there's all kinds of flexibility now in the way donors are funding the COVID response because they have no choice but to do so. And I think that is an opening in saying, well, you were able to do it in this case. Now let's see if you can't do it all the time. Were those restrictions necessary in the first place? And I think it has to be in their interest, and you have to make it in their interest. But a more local and ethical and less parachutey response is going to be cheaper and more effective. So I can't see why it isn't in their interest. I think everyone has really bought into this. It's just a matter of actually doing it, which comes back to the leadership question that I mentioned earlier. So I guess just to summarize, the assumption for most aid organizations is that to grow your impact, you have to grow your size and you have to grow your funding. And I guess my challenge to you is, what if you tried testing the hypothesis that with a smaller size and less funding, you could actually maintain or even grow your level of impact? And if that was your goal, how would you go about doing it? So often I hear NGOs talking about survival, like we just have to survive, we have to figure out how we can keep existing, everything, you know, our funding is being cut, et cetera, and like hanging on. And what if survival wasn't the goal? What if you were to start with a clean slate and say, in 2020, what is the most effective way to alleviate suffering, whether or not I am part of the answer, and be open to what the answer to that question is? I will stop there.
Sorry about that. Hi, thank you so much, Eva. I was taking notes as you were speaking, and then I had to find my screen to get off of mute. Thank you so much. I think that what you've just shared with us, you got a lot into a very short period of time. But I think they are the words that we need to be hearing and the challenges that we need to be hearing. And I think that, I know that many of us are struggling with this and really thinking about, what is my role within this? I'll speak for myself, but I've been working in global development for almost 30 years. And I know why I got into it. I know why I get up in the morning and why I want to contribute to this. But it is challenging and a little scary when everything that you have built your career on and the things that you feel passionately about are then being challenged by people who are articulating how our global development approach is in many ways built on racism, built on colonialism, and built on sand. And so I think a lot of us are rethinking why it is that we're engaged and how we can engage, and who should really be holding the power and making the decisions, and how we can contribute to that. So really, thank you very much. I also just want to note that, and this, I'll segue into my first question for you, but you know, Humentum is an organization that works with other organizations to really help them do their work better, more efficiently, more effectively. We work on policies and standards. We work on financial systems. We do a lot of training. And I think, I mean, I have had people say to me, well, this is unusual for Humentum to be talking about sector transformation and transformation across global development, because you all just do the operational stuff. And for me, you know, so many of us, when we're thinking about transformation, are also thinking, well, what can I do? How can I contribute? And then how do we actually make that change happen? So I guess perhaps my first question for you is, can you talk a little bit about, for all of us who are on this call, for all of us who have, you know, colleagues who are asking these questions as well, we're doing things at a practical level and operational level. What can an individual do to make a difference, to move transformation forward? How can people who are working at a really applied level contribute to that change? Over to you.
And I'm just like sweating in this small room, so forgive me if you see me like wiping. I always get nervous about answering those questions because I'm just a journalist, but we do observe this sector, and I guess what we do observe the power dynamics and the resistance to change. So I come at it from that lens. I guess my argument or my answer would be nothing changes until a critical mass of people want it to change. And so you becoming part of that critical mass is, or you're one more person that's going to demand change. And for NGO executives or heads of UN agencies, sometimes the push has to come from below. It has to come from their staff. And we've seen that happen at times where it's the staff that are really pushing, saying they want more accountability, saying that the safeguarding is not up to scruff, et cetera. And so I think there is a lot of power in each individual in an organization making clear what their vision is so that the leadership can notice when there's a certain trend happening. The other thing I would say is that so often the supposed blockages for change are operational. Now, I don't think that's actually true, and it is most often about hanging on to power. But donors will always say the challenge to localization is the operational way that they're set up to be able to only fund certain big agencies, and that they don't have the resources and so on. So actually, I would argue that operational folks do have quite a number of keys to be able to say, well, actually, I can make that happen for you operationally. And then if the change still doesn't happen, then you've exposed that the real reason is something else. And so kind of clearing the operational way for those changes then puts even more pressure, I suppose, on leaders to face up to the kind of honest reasons why those changes aren't happening. That's it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think one of the other things that so many of us struggle with too is that, as you've already referenced, I mean, so much of the way that our sector is set up is, we have very deeply entrenched rules and ways of doing business. We've had a comment in the chat around how, Charity Navigator absolutely rewards a growth trajectory for organizations. We know that, our donors encourage actually competition between NGOs. They require competition between NGOs. And so, even when we want to work together, we are then also put into a dynamic where we absolutely have to compete. And so, we're stuck in this dichotomy of, on the one hand, knowing that collaboration is probably going to be a healthier way to go about things, but on the other hand, being really positioned within an institutional structure and a working environment where that is very much discouraged. So could you speak to that a little bit?
You know how well, I'm now understanding the term managing upwards because my staff tell me that they have to manage me all the time. So in business, this whole concept of managing upwards is very well established, and I don't see why it shouldn't be the same in the sector where you manage the donors. And there are examples of donors that are opening up to other ways of working. DFID, the H2H network that I mentioned, DFID is funding it in part because it thinks it could encourage a more collaborative way of working. And in fact, I mean, the other example, the Dutch Relief Alliance, was the government saying, we're forcing you to work together by limiting access to funding to those who do work together. So I think there is an increasing interest by donors in collaboration. So you wouldn't be up against a lot of resistance, I think, to be proposing more of those kinds of models. Now, does the system encourage bad behaviors and have a whole raft of bad incentives? Absolutely, yes. What does it take to break them? It takes leadership. When WFP and UNHCR are fighting over who's going to get the cash, the kind of lead role in cash programming. And yes, I'm sure the donors contributed to that competition to some extent. What does it take to break that? It takes one of them saying, actually, we're not going to play this game and we're going to do things differently. So it's unsatisfying in the sense that it's not like a concrete thing that you do, but it is just standing up to say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, and proposing something different. And I think so often, you know, a lot of the donors I've talked to, they want the change, but they are short-staffed like everyone, and so they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to reimagine the way it could be. And if you put forward that alternative, I think you'd have a listening ear on the other end.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to ask, well, the next question is kind of along the same lines, but shifting from donors to national governments. Again, you know, we are looking to this shift to localization, or whatever you want to call that. But we also know that as we start looking at, you know, management at the local and national levels within countries that were traditionally, and I know I'm using a loaded term, the beneficiary countries, we also see that local and national governments do not necessarily have a good track record of robust management and accountability of funds, or stewardship of funds. And, you know, I think across the sector, across how we all work, we are confronted with corruption everywhere. And I am not just saying in, again, developing countries or whatever terms you want to apply. We are absolutely grappling with corruption at a level, at an unheard of level in the United States right now. But, you know, if we are shifting power to the countries where the work is taking place, how do we work with local and national institutions and hold them to account?
I'm sorry, I do have to push back on the premise, because it
Sure.
suggests that somehow national and local institutions are more likely to be untrustable and corrupt than everyone else. And it's not like the international aid community has such a wonderful track record where it hasn't been caught up in all kinds of scandals itself. And so I would see it much more as, how do you raise the bar of the entire sector when it comes to accountability? I mean, the international, I always say this, but the international aid sector is the only one in the world in which the same people are assessing the needs, responding to the needs, and reporting back on the quality of their response, which is a clear conflict of interest in any other sector in the world. And yet that's perfectly acceptable in aid. So I'm not sure that international aid is much cleaner, let's say, than any other form of aid. I think they each just come with their own set of risks. But what's the way of working with national governments? I think international aid workers need to remember that the whole concept of aid was when the national government is not able or willing to do the work itself. And when they are, to be ready to work in support of them rather than instead of them, or directing them, I think would go a long way to building the trust that would then be, that would then flow both ways. And I think right now, there is such an environment of mistrust between both sides, not that there's only two sides, but, and before you can talk about corruption and accountability, you need to establish a relationship of trust. And the best way to do that is to show up in a way that is genuinely in service of the people, rather than, and including the government, rather than kind of the one in charge who's going to run the show. Now, you've got all kinds of governments that are party to conflict, and that model is obviously very complex, but I think that kind of mentality, even in the non-complex crises, does not exist, or the non-complex contexts, including development context, doesn't exist. And then we always turn to like the really complicated ones to say, see, it can't work because in this context, you can't trust the government because they're the ones killing the people. Well, what about all the other places where you could and you still didn't do it? So again, you're gonna stop asking me questions soon, because I'm gonna have these roundabout answers to each of them. But I would say your first step should be to build trust.
Excellent, thank you. So moving from that, I mean, you mentioned about looking at board and leadership within NGOs, looking at ourselves, holding ourselves to account. And so could you talk a little bit about, you know, it's not just setting the bar high. It's not just setting our objectives to have whatever we want to term as a diverse board or diverse leadership, but how do we hold ourselves to account? How do we use metrics within that, reporting within that, to hold ourselves to account?
I mean, that'd be pretty simple, right? You set a target for what kind of organization you want to be.
Or,
we want to have
well, maybe
50.
here, sorry, let me, I didn't state that as clearly as I could have. There is not necessarily a willingness to hold ourselves to account.
Right.
So how do we move the needle to actually get there?
I mean, that is the way I approach this whole topic is this change is happening. It's either going to happen with you kind of proactively managing it, or it's going to happen with you having to catch up and react to it after the fact. Which one do you prefer? And so you can hang on and maintain the status quo and eventually find yourself completely irrelevant, or you can say, this is the way the world is going and I'm going to be ahead of it. I think it's easy to say all that, and it's a lot more complicated. I mean, we ourselves are in the process of trying to diversify our board, and it's not simple. But I think making a clear intent, making that intent public, saying we are aiming to have 50% of our board women, 50% of our board people of color, and then have the public hold you accountable is one good way of doing things. And then the other, I'd say, is just be honest. Like, the amount of times we see NGOs that are and frankly, more often UN agencies that are really untransparent about what's going on, and trying to make things look a certain way and trying to position themselves as certain. Just be honest. We made a mistake. We messed up. We have to do better. And kind of appeal to the more you present yourself as perfect angels, the more people are going to want to tear you down, and the more you recognize that you are imperfect and that you understand your flaws and that you articulate those flaws and that you have a plan to work on them, I think the more you build public trust. And that also is going to be an existential question, right? Because a lot of the NGOs following the Oxfam, sorry, I keep telling myself not to call it the Oxfam scandal, but the sex abuse scandal, the public trust cost thousands of dollars for NGOs. They lost tons of their budgets because people just didn't believe in them anymore. So this is actually a bottom line issue. It's not just a soft wishy-washy issue. And so yeah, I just say set targets and make them public and invite people to hold you accountable.
Thanks. Yeah, this is making me think about another role that donors can play, and we have seen some donors do this, and we've actually got some suggestions in the chat around this as well, is, donors can also leverage their funding power for transformation around, the suggestion in the chat is donors could start demanding to see solid exit strategies followed by progress reports towards those exits. We've also seen donors, the Global Fund has put in place the country coordinating mechanisms in countries where Global Fund money has been being spent. Those are not perfect mechanisms, but they absolutely have brought civil society a place at the table that they did not have previously. I think another suggestion I've seen recently emerging more and more is around having, accountability mechanisms within any country that is receiving a donor's funding to actually be judging who is going to be getting the money, how the money is going to be spent, and how well it is being spent. So shifting the power from sitting in the donor mission or in the donor headquarters to actually sitting in an empowered committee that can actually be making these decisions at a local and national level. So we do see some of these structures. I think we have a few more minutes. I'm shifting gears a little bit, but could you speak just a little bit about the spectrum between, and you talked about the importance of the use of words earlier, between aid, development, humanitarianism, assistance, you know, we have had, I think, probably a false dichotomy between humanitarian and development work, and it has put us into camps that tend to be more competitive than they probably should be. Could you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, and I think what I said earlier about solidarity and justice was essentially saying that humanitarian, I mean, I just personally find it difficult to keep pumping money into humanitarian aid when it is clear that it will never, ever, ever come close to being enough to the needs. And if that money was reinvested into ensuring that those problems don't exist in the first place, it would just be a much smarter way to operate. And I think in all of these conversations that we're having around Nexus and around resilience and so on, that is essentially the direction that, I mean, of course, there are plenty of people who continue to believe that humanitarian aid needs to exist and will likely always need to exist, and that you do need to keep saving lives while you try to change the system. But I think there is a deep reflection needed now about that, the balance and the emphasis and the center of gravity between those things. And yes, perhaps I think there may well be the winning side of that argument may well be that it all becomes one effort, and that is, you know, to look at it in the terms that I've been framing it, which is how do we alleviate suffering, and what are the kind of key, what is core, what is at the heart of that suffering, what is causing that, and let's start there. Knowing that the kind of whatever 25 billion that we throw into humanitarian aid every year is a drop in the bucket compared to the need. Is there a more effective way to operate? So I think one way of describing that I found quite helpful, and again, I'm just a curator, as you can see, just quoting everyone else, but Hugo Slim, who was head of policy at the ICRC for a while and is now back at Oxford, he said, instead of talking about nexus and humanitarian development, spectrum, et cetera, just say with everything that we do, we should be thinking both short-term and long-term. So you should never be making an investment that is only short-term. Everything you do to help in the short-term should also be having some kind of long-term positive impact. And maybe that's a simpler way to think about the whole architecture.
Great. I am afraid we are going to have to close out the session. I do want to note that we will be saving the chat. I want to thank everybody for the questions and comments that you have contributed here. I think we've gotten to many of them, but probably not all of them. Humentum also will be really trying to take what we've gotten here in terms of your contributions and use that as inspiration for the work that we're going to be doing going forward. So please don't think that this ends here today. This is a launch, and this is very much the beginning and continuation of really challenging and I hope invigorating discussions that are going to help all of us do our work and achieve real transformation that helps right the balance from the way that we've been used to working in the past. I want to thank Hiba Ali for everything that you've shared with us today. You have, again, gotten so much information and so many thoughts and provocation into a small amount of time. And as we can see in the chats, everyone really appreciates what you've shared with us today. And I will look forward to a continuing relationship with you and with the new Humanitarian and Humentum. And so let's all give quiet applause across Zoom for Heba. And I will turn it back to Kim, who will take us into the close. I think she may just turn it back to me, but Kim, over to you.
Christine, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, but I have just dropped some things into the chat. First of all, Heba, thank you so much. That was, as Christine mentioned, thought-provoking, inspiring. I think it is the right energizing and frankly call to action for us that I hope we will continue to engage with over the course of OpEx 365 and do so in really practical and hopefully meaningful ways. I've put a few things into the chat. I'll drop it in again for those of you who are registered tomorrow for OpEx 365. We're really excited to get started with you. We are welcoming you on our platform as we speak. If you're interested in learning more about it, please reach out to us. I'll put the information in the chat. Other than that, Christine, I'll turn it over to you to close.
Great, thank you. So I don't think there's much left to be said. You know, really, we are looking forward to the year to come. We encourage you to continue to engage with Humentum in any way that you can. One of the things that I am particularly excited about is that we have many ways that you can engage with us. And so whether it is doing, you know, learning through the learning systems, whether it is taking part in our regular roundtables, I want to make a particular shout out because we now have a young professionals roundtable once a month. That's a really exciting roundtable, and we're hearing some great ideas coming out of that. So, you know, anyone who thinks of themselves as a young professional, please join us there. And then, of course, the OpEx 365 events and the CEO series, which I will be facilitating with help from a number of resource people. So really, we look forward to the year to come. We look forward to all of us joining together on this transformation. We will continue to be focusing on doing our work excellently and with impact and efficiency and effectiveness, but also really thinking about how that goes hand in hand with working towards transformation across the sector, across the globe. So thank you, everyone. I also want to thank the Humentum team that put in just untold hours getting today's launch together, and then getting together the series that are launching when we turn off the Zoom today. The first solution session is tomorrow the 16th, so please join us. And if you need any more information on OpEx 365 or Humentum, you can find us on the website. I will also just reiterate, and it is in the chat, that we will be sharing a recording of the talk with Heba, and so please, you know, feel free to share that with your colleagues. And I think I will be going back to it and watching it again to really fully capture everything that she shared with us today. So with that, I wish you all a good rest of your day. I wish you peace. I wish you good health, and good luck in all of the things, all of your endeavors and all of your work. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.